Hey, it's great to be with you today. My name is David Nadler. I am the founder of Fourthstream.com and been teaching for quite a few years and getting some clarity on some things. So I've got a series that I'm going to do here that different kind of a podcast kind of a thing. Fourthstream.com is dedicated to helping people find hope. So hopefully that's exactly what will happen as we talk about some of these subjects together. First one relates to turbulence and imperfection. And so it's going to take me a little bit to kind of set this up. I've been contemplating it over the last several months. I've done a little bit of public speaking about it, but I really wanted to talk about it kind of from a personal conversation perspective. So that's what I'm going for here. And I've got some notes and I've got some slides, and as this unfolds, we'll figure out the best way to pass that on to you so that you can make use of that in any way that might be helpful. The title of this particular subject, and in fact I've just finished a book about it, and I've called it the Turbulence of Imperfection. And like many people, I've found that I'm not in a perfect environment. And so I'm kind of at the mercy of some of the things that go on around me. And within that, to set this up, and I think in this podcast, we can pursue it probably through 2/3 of this conversation. We may have to return to it sometime, but there's basically 5 different elements related to this turbulence of imperfection that I'd like to examine, talk about it together, help you think about it, and also get some of your input on some of the things that you've learned related to these kinds of experiences. The first thing under turbulence of imperfection is the idea of chaos and order. So I want to have a little bit of a conversation about that today. How do those two things fit together, and how do they both impact us? Then a second is just to talk about the concept of turbulence, because I see turbulence as something more personal than what's happening in the general imperfection that's around us. So I want to talk about that a little bit, which will lead into a conversation about suffering, because even though we like to avoid the experience and the idea of suffering, nonetheless, it seems to come into our lives and impact us. And then finally, I want to add the subject of faith, at least a little bit this time through. And but don't mistake that for religion. I'll talk about that in a little bit. I don't really have much room for religion. That to me is different than personal faith. So we'll talk about that a little bit. So the turbulence of imperfection. So chaos is like the wildness of things that go on. There are a lot of just crazy things, not just interpersonally, but just take a look at the mass of the universe, the incredible things that we can see in microbiology. There are all of these processes that have just a wildness to them and an unpredictability. I mean, if you look at what's going on in the cosmos right now and you recognize the chaos that was necessary in order for there to be some kind of pulling together in some kind of order. So there's a wildness side of life. However you feel about chaos and turbulence, chaos is that wild part, and it's also the unpredictable part. They're the things that we just can't control. And I'm not saying that one is exclusive of the other. In fact, part of my premise is that I think they may be way more tied together than a lot of people give them credit for. So chaos is the wild unpredictability of all things that we see, of everything created, including humanity itself. Well, then within that idea of chaos and wildness, there's the turbulence. And as you can see, if you've looked at any of the artwork, or if you look at the cover to this particular book that I'm finishing up right now. I've got a picture of a stone has been dropped into water, and you know how the ripples kind of go out. And this is my view in the midst of chaos and in the midst of order and the midst of imperfection. There's this whole picture of personal trouble. Okay, so these aren't the things that necessarily impact everybody, although they might, but they're the kinds of things that happen in my life, my own personal turbulence. So there's chaos and there's order, and then there's also kind of on the other end of it, there's this personal turbulence that each person experiences. And it's all different. I mean, it's not like we all have the same experience with difficulty and turbulence. It's that we have our own circles, we have our own personal issues, personal troubles, personal challenges, whatever you want to call them. So you've got chaos and you've got turbulence, and then you also have the idea of imperfection, which is a lot bigger. And we just seem to be in a hostile environment. At least that's how it appears to me. And I use the term world at war. I read this, I think, in a John Eldredge book once. He talked about we are born into a world at war. And that really resonated with me, because I pretty much feel like that's what I've experienced in my lifetime. Now, have I lived in a country that's been at war? Well, not really, and thank God for that, because I look at what happens around the globe and I think, man, I would really hate to experience some of the things that people experience. But nonetheless, it appears to me that we are in a world at war, and so you have a clash of perfection and imperfection. Now, it's way more complicated than that, but I'm trying to distill this into just a picture. So you've got chaos, which is the wildness and unpredictability that stands side by side with order. And you've got turbulence, which is like the personal trouble that people experience. And then you've got this overall general imperfection that we all seem to be born into. And the environment appears to be very much a warlike warfare kind of a thing. And emerging from chaos and order and turbulence and imperfection, and those are conversations we'll have here in a few minutes, there's the idea too that suffering to me, which I've had a lot of contact or experience with suffering, and I'm not saying it's all been mine. I've just been around a lot of people because of the nature of what I do for work. And so the idea of suffering is like a personal pain. Everywhere from very intense and sweeping all the way to somewhat mild and impactful and smaller levels. But the suffering, the things that you wake up thinking about at night, or the reasons that you can't sleep, or the tough things that happen in your life. And then right along with that suffering, and I have a biblical worldview, and again, I want to talk about that later, because I don't want you to think I have a religious worldview, because I don't really at all. I've kind of rejected that decades ago. But there's the whole idea of faith, and faith is, for me, God experience. It's the experience that I have between myself and God, and that you have between yourself and God in the context of suffering. So often faith is side by side with suffering. So I don't know if that makes any sense. And like I said, I've got these slides and I've got notes, and you can look at it and process it with me. I've been thinking about this for several years, so I don't expect it to be like really easy to communicate. But the turbulence of imperfection, you've got chaos and order, and we're somewhere in the middle of it. You've got the personal troubles that happen to individuals, and that is our personal turbulence. We have this imperfection because we're born into a world that appears to be at war, and then we have this personal pain, different levels of pain that people experience because of suffering. And then alongside of that, you have the idea of faith, which everybody has some kind of faith. You can say you don't have faith. I can accept a lot more that you you're not religious, because I can relate to that, but people have faith. You have faith in something, I pretty much will guarantee you this after, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of conversations and thousands of hours discussing this with people. Now, part of doing this together, I'd like you to kind of know a little bit about me. And obviously, I'm not a young man, but I'm not an old dog either. So I'm kind of in that part of my life. One of my kids calls it the sage time, where you've seen enough about life that you are able to process it into some kind of cohesive conclusion or whatever. And there are basically three different disciplines that have helped me with this. The first one is science. And I've always been pretty much scientifically aware. I have been so amazed at what's happened in science in my lifetime, especially over the last 4 or 5 decades. And science is just the facts of the amazing things of the universe. And you'll hear me talk about the macro, and you'll hear me talk about the micro, because, you know, whatever part of scientific observation or discovery that we look at, it's just like pouring out information, not just about what it's talking about, but about life and about designer and about the nature of things. And what I have concluded is that science, and what passed for science 40 years ago, was much oriented toward empirical data and investigating empirical data. So when I talk about science, I'm talking about pure, non-political data. Part of the challenge right now is that because of technology and because of where we're at in our world, all I have to do is say something is true, and that makes it true. I don't feel that way about science. I feel there is a purity, a non-political way of looking at data, which I think it's hard to do. I think it's hard to do in any of these three disciplines, but that's one of them. So that's always a backdrop for me. And I'm not afraid of science in any way, shape, or form. I welcome it. In fact, if anything, it often proves some of my faith issues to me as I investigate the science and the beauty of the science. The second thing, in order for us to relate together as these, 20 or 25 podcasts unfold, I don't know how long they're actually going to be. I'll do one a week. At least that's my plan. The second is philosophy. So you've got the facts of science, and then you've got philosophy, which is people wrestling with meaning. And I love philosophy. That's one of the reasons I love music. I've been involved with music all of my life, listening to the messages that come out of different songwriters. I've loved poetry. I was talking with one of my grandsons the other day. He's reading Marcus Aurelius, and we were discussing the different things that come out of that perspective. So there are so many historic philosophers and current philosophers that are really worth taking a look at, because they are wrestling with meaning. And just like true science doesn't scare me, true philosophy doesn't scare me either, because if somebody is wrestling with the real meaning of life, then I want to engage on that same level that they are. So science and philosophy, and then the other thing that I can't get away from because of where I've been in the last, in fact, we were celebrating a holiday, and I was thinking, this is my 48th Christmas, and I'm older than that, obviously, but since I met God. And during that time, my authentic God connection has been unfolding. So you've got science, which I bring into the things that I talk about. You've got philosophy, which I love to ruminate over and bring it in to the conversation. And then you've got the issue of faith and the authentic God connection that comes from it. So that tells you a little bit about me. I'm really not here to tell you what to think. I mean, I don't appreciate that when people do that to me. I try not to do that to anybody else. I'm just an observer. But I'm also, as I observe, I am assimilating. And you, like me, have your own worldview. It's just what happens to us because that's what human beings do. So that's just a little bit of a background. And kind of tied in with that a little bit is the idea of, and in fact, we might pop this slide up, I don't know, but it talks about religion with a question mark. And so it's kind of it's not a religion versus authentic spirituality, but they can be at odds with each other. They were during Jesus's time. I mean, who was all of his conflict with? Rome? I don't think so. It was with the religious leaders of the Jewish nation. So that's one aspect as far as us, communicating and getting to know each other and making use of the information that I have for you. Religion is different to me than authentic spirituality. And I am careful about that. I'm careful, it's not like I don't have my traditions. Everybody has their traditions, but one of the things that Jesus taught is that when you elevate traditions to the level of what God has spoken into the world, you may be making a mistake. Right along with that, if you look at historic Christianity, which, I don't know, I got a lot of feelings about that, and we can talk about that as this whole thing unfolds, but there's the idea of theology, one of the big ology words, and the idea, there's this theology and there's that theology. And what I discovered, somewhere in my journey, and I've read lots of theological books, different perspectives, different religions. I'm not just sitting here and talking about being a Christ follower like in a vacuum. I do understand at least the basics about other religions of the world and have talked to people. But somewhere I figured out that theology, that's all fine, but what about the Bible interpreting itself? And that's exactly where I'm at right now. So when I talk about the God story, when I talk about the Bible, there are like these woven threads that go all the way through the scriptures. And those are important for me to follow because if God has spoken, and I believe that he has, I want to know what he has to say about it. And then I want to integrate myself into that. I don't want to flip that thing around at all. And then I also have a thing here that with a question mark. So I got religion, question mark, theology, question mark, and opinion. I value people's opinions, but they really ought to be tested and proven. Just because I have an opinion, does that make it valid? I don't know that it does. And so that's a little bit more just about me. So let's return a little bit to the concept, the idea of chaos and order. I have several observations about that, and I've kind of painted a picture, but I want to develop it a little bit more deeply. First of all, number one, the world is not a friendly place. And we can want it to be. We can paint a picture of it being a friendly place, but the reality is that if you honestly look at history, the world is not a friendly place. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. I think there's a conversation that Benjamin Franklin and some guys were having when they were, a part of the founding of America. They talked about there were two things that you could count on for sure, death and taxes. I don't think they were talking about taxes. I think they were talking about oppression. Because when you look at history, you see that the world is not a friendly place. There are the haves and the have-nots. There are the oppressors, and there are those who are subjugated to the oppressors. So within chaos and order, that's one observation that I accept as a maxim. And I'd like to present to you as a backdrop for these conversations. Second of all, what I've been wrestling with related to to imperfection and turbulence is that imperfection is either planned or it's unplanned. It's a planned condition or it's an unplanned condition within the cosmos of the creation. So we're going to talk about that. I'm going to answer that in like a 30-minute podcast, but we'll visit that a number of times. But however you feel about whether it's planned or unplanned, although that has huge ramifications, imperfection's here. And if you struggle with believing that we are in an imperfect environment, I'd really like to encourage you to reconsider that, because you might be living in la la land. I don't know. The third thing is that mankind has a dual problem that appears unsolvable. And I referred to this with my quote of Benjamin Franklin. The inevitability of death is the first part of it. And, try as we might, I know people like to believe, especially a lot of my younger friends and my kids, they're really hopeful because of technology. We're going to live to 140 years and all that kind of stuff, and that's cool with me. But the reality is that death is going to be inevitable. So if you live for 50 years, or if you live for 80 years, or if you live for 140 years, where does that fit in on the time continuum related to value? I don't know. I like to think about that, and I like to ponder that. So you've got this dual problem that appears unsolvable. What can I do about that? I mean, obviously, if you're 35 and you're listening to me right now and you look at me and you go, whoa, he's older than I am. Well, that's right. Well, I used to be 35 and I look like you. Maybe worse, maybe better. I don't know. I'd have to be able to see you. But there's the inevitability of death, and I can't do anything about that. You can't do anything about that. Nobody in history, well, except for one person, has been able to do anything about it, but even he didn't escape the inevitability of it. And the second thing with that dual problem is not only the inevitability of death, but it's the surety of oppression. And there's something in our nature, there's something in our DNA that makes some people feel like we have the right to take advantage of other people to benefit ourselves, whether it be related to money or power or influence. And that's a dual problem that I don't know. I haven't really been able to divorce that from the human race in any way, shape, or form. My fifth point, as far as setting up just general philosophy about the turbulence of imperfection, is that turbulence appears to me to be the localized or the personalized impact of imperfection that is everywhere. So I've kind of alluded to this, but it's like I'm in this imperfect soup. And I was born into it. My birth process was probably as unpleasant as anybody else's was, because that's the nature of things. And when I came into the world, there were all of these chaotic, imperfect factors that were going to impact me. Like our youngest son was born with a heart defect. And so all of a sudden we were wrestling with something, was it something we did? Is it something hereditary or whatever? But the reality is that there is localized, personalized imperfection, and it springs up everywhere. And we try to avoid, especially getting together and weighing that all out together, because it's just it's so heavy. There is so much of it. Maybe if you're an American, we escape some of it, but visit a different country and look at the oppression that's there, and look at the impact of life and death in different places than our own. So that's kind of the fourth thing that I don't know, I think about that. Also, one of my sons says, excuse me, been listening to Jordan Peterson for a while. And he and I have been looking at some of his videos and listening to some of his podcasts. And I like a lot of things that Jordan Peterson expresses and does. And I'm not like I don't think Jordan Peterson is some great apostle or some great prophet. I just think that he gets a lot of stuff right. That's how it strikes me. But Jordan Peterson, and I want you to think about this related to this conversation. Jordan Peterson thinks that the 20th century was the most barbaric in human history. And have you ever thought about that? I mean, when I read that, I thought, really? The most barbaric in human history? And I'm interested in your thoughts about that, because after I weighed that out from his book, 12 Rules for Life, I thought, oh, I can see why he said that. I can see why he believed that. So, if that's true, if we've just finished the most barbaric century in history, according to Jordan Peterson, what about this whole idea of evolving upwards? I don't know. It's a question for me. And I also, in this conversation about turbulence and imperfection, I have a question. I wonder, do turbulence and imperfection, do they open as many doors as they close? I have a tendency to look at both of them as enemies. I don't like the ripples in my own life, particularly the bigger ripples. I don't like the fact that I was born into a world at war that impacts me every day. And I have to come to the conclusion that as things came about, was that a factor that was taken into account so that it can open doors that wouldn't ever open if turbulence and imperfection weren't there? Just a question that I'd like to revisit at a different time. I've been reading some really good books. I'm kind of a reader. I've done my forays with fiction, and I'm pretty much more, though, of a nonfiction kind of a reader. I like history. I like philosophical history, philosophical writing. And I've been reading a book by a guy named Perry Marshall that one of my sons knows Perry and has done some work for him. And he's kind of thinks of things from a scientific perspective, and that leads to two other points, kind of background points. Is everything really as random as it has been taught per Darwinian evolution? I'm doing a lot of reading right now, and I'm thinking, man, that whole thing was riddled with a lot of issues. And I'm not sure randomness can be just chosen when you want to use it to make a particular point and then ignore it at other times. So that's one question that I have related to this whole subject of turbulence and imperfection. Also, are the fine-tuned machines, which are genomes and cells. Now, I don't claim to be an authority on genomes and cells or anything related to microbiology, but I can read. And so genomes and cells, do they work because they were made to work that way? Or because they adaptively have come to the point where they can, or are both of those things true? So I have lots of questions. And I'd like just to introduce that to you and think about that, and maybe start investigating that together about random chance. And where does science and mere chance fit together? There just seem to be, I don't know, some inconsistencies there. And I just want to be honest with myself. So in all of this, I ask myself the question and invite you into the question, the purpose of turbulence and imperfection. What is it? And I've come to several conclusions, and I'd like you to test these and weigh these out. Maybe they fit your paradigm, maybe they don't. But first one is, related to the purpose of turbulence and imperfection is victory in an epic war. We have been born into a world at war, and I think the purpose of turbulence and imperfection is to bring us to a place of victory. So that's something I'm contemplating, I'm weighing. The second part of that is the purpose of turbulence and imperfection is to produce faith and hope and love for the welfare of the soul, not just as something that's monetizable or can get me but what I want to get, but what about the things that faith, hope, and love do for my soul? And then I think finally the purpose of turbulence and imperfection is preparation for ultimate reward and glory. I think everything we experience is not only being kept track of, I think it counts for something. So I see definite potential purpose in turbulence and imperfection. Now that leads into a conversation about suffering, which we can talk about at a later time. I have several thoughts about that, or things that I'm weighing out. First one is how tough was it really for Jesus to suffer? Because we have a lot of data about what that looked like in a variety of ways. And there's a passage in Hebrews that says, who in the days of his flesh, and it's talking about the Son, it's talking about Jesus, he offered up requests and prayers with loud crying and tears to the one who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Interesting. So where does suffering fit into this whole idea of turbulence and imperfection with God having specific goals for suffering? Now, I don't think I'm going to ever be able to answer the question about why suffering. I don't. Well, I will when I stand before God and kind of get the lowdown on the roots of that. And then I also think about that related to Jesus, and he was pretty much an outcast from all the religious people around him, even from his family. And so on the cross, when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? I'm thinking intense. I'm thinking Jesus' suffering was incredibly intense. And so I think he really does kind of understand imperfection and turbulence from my perspective. So that just ends with a few questions, and we'll address some of these as we continue to visit some of these subjects. First of all, how can there be a perfect God with such imperfection endemic to all of creation? I mean, it's like it's everywhere. You can't get away from it. You can pretend like it's not there, but everywhere in all of creation, there seems to be imperfection. And how does that stack up with a perfect God? That's a question that I have. Also, as we were just talking about, why was God's Son subject to suffering? Why was that his way? Why was that the path that had been laid out for him? And then I have an ultimate question too about what is the glory of God when you have no equals? If there's no contrast at all, and all things are subject to you. And so I think that forms a key too to some of these bigger questions. And then also right along with that, what does suffering produce that other experiences not produce? As you can see, this is a whole subject in and of itself. Things like humility, growth in faith, gaining perspective about life and the meaning of life. And I would ask you a question when you think about your personal turbulence. How has it served you? When you look back at your experiences, when you look at your story, I personally look back and I go, I wouldn't have chosen any of the awful times of suffering I've experienced, but I have to be honest, they were watershed opportunities for me to grow. So how has your personal turbulence served you? How has it discouraged you? Maybe suffering doesn't get processed for you and you don't have this backdrop that I have and it discourages you. And then within that, how does your faith expand and grow? And that kind of leads me to, and this is another subject that we'll talk about, what tools are in my toolbox to walk toward turbulence and toward imperfection and even suffering. What are the things that I have that I can count on, that I can grab a hold of and do something with? And I'm just going to make this quick list because we'll talk about it in the weeks and the months ahead. First of all, the God story is the big picture, and I think that's one of the tools that's in our toolbox. Second of all, whatever personal connection you've experienced with God, I think that's one of the tools. It's not perfect experiences, but it is real experiences. And so that's the second tool I think I have. Also, I have found forgiveness to be extremely freeing and extremely potent as a tool in living out my life in the midst of the imperfection that I see around me. Also, another tool is immortality. How do you feel about immortality? Do you think we are immortals in a movie sort of sense? Do you think in a biblical sense that we are immortal? Where do you stand on immortality? Because I think that's one of the tools, and it's why we're all kind of taken with that. We're kind of obsessed with the idea of pictures of immortality. And then also the other tool that I've seen, so you got the God story in the big picture, you've got our God connections that we experience with God, forgiveness and the power that is in forgiveness, and then where we stand on immortality, two different things. We'll probably talk about that as well. But authentic friends and personal community. Who are the people that you hang with? And what's good about that, and what is difficult about that? So, I almost feel bad that we're looking at such a sweeping topic here. But here's the basic conclusions, and hopefully this will hang together for however long you are interested in hanging out with me, because I'm going to process all of these things that we're talking about and do my best to communicate that and include you in it. So here are my conclusions. First of all, imperfection is where we live. That's all there is to it. I live in an imperfect world. Turbulence is how that imperfection impacts me personally. So the old the rock in the water, and then the people that I love, the rock that drops in right next to me with the people who are close to me. So imperfection, turbulence. Also, I think suffering, and this is one of my conclusions, is God's tool to take us places we would never, ever choose to go on our own. So I'd like to contemplate that together with you, and I've got some stories that I can share about that, and some experiences and some things I've learned, both from the God story, also philosophy, and maybe not so much from science, but that does kind of frame part of the conversation. And then finally, I've concluded that reward or immortality is the goal. This is not the goal. This is to produce something that will get us toward the goal. And so I'll pop up the slide right now. I'm just finishing up a book, The Turbulence of Imperfection. I'm doing the audio book right now, and that'll all be coming out here soon. But it's not so much the book coming out. The conversation, I really want to see it enhanced. And if you would like to be a part of that, I think it would be totally awesome. So thanks for putting up with me. Thanks for listening. I really, you can tell by looking at me, I've been around for a while, so I should have learned something by now, right? And you'll have to decide if I'm wise, am I a sage, or am I just crazy like so many other people in the world? Thanks for listening. See you soon.